Good morning, scholars. Today we're going to go through our notes for macromolecules. So you should have picked up this paper in class. If not, I did link a copy that you can print off in the Canvas module. So make sure you're filling this out as you go. Obviously, feel free to stop, pause, whatever you need to do so you have time to fill everything out. I'm going to go through things pretty quickly, so you probably have to go through and pause. But make sure if you have any questions on it, you send me an email, and we can also talk about it at our next in-person class. All right, so the big chunk of our biochemistry unit is this macromolecules right here. And so if we break down this word, macro means big, molecule are things that we talk about that are made of atoms. And so we have big molecules, and essentially is what it is. And so we're going to talk about what are the four main macromolecules, what are the elements that make them up, what are the monomers or the building blocks that make them up, and what do they do? So to begin with, we talked about this in our in-person class when we talked about atoms and elements. All of biology and all of life is essentially centered around the carbon element, the carbon atom. And so one of the reasons that carbon is so versatile, and you see it right there in that first point, is that it has 4 valence electrons. By the way, there's nothing for this on here. This is kind of background on what we need to know for later. Because of those 4 valence electrons, which is that outer ring of electrons, it easily bonds with many other elements. The important ones are hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and then also phosphorus and sulfur. And so with that, it can form long carbon chains. Now, the 4 macromolecules that we're talking about are carbohydrates, which is basically our quick energy, lipids, which is our energy storage and builds our membranes like the cell membrane, nucleic acids, which is DNA and RNA, and then proteins. Each of these macromolecules is made up of little building blocks called monomers. And then those building blocks put together make our entire building or whatever it is we're trying to make, and we call those polymers. And if you break down those words, monomer, one, so one brick, poly means many, so it's many of those bricks put together. All right, so just make sure we're on our right page with that. So an example of this, if I have a train, a long train, each train car makes up its monomer. Same thing with a pearl necklace. If I have a long chain of pearls, each individual pearl will be its monomer. So the polymer is the pearl necklace, the entire thing, each monomer, or each pearl is a monomer. All right, so now for the biomolecules, the molecules of life. So our first one is carbohydrates. Personally, this is my favorite because as we talk about this, you're going to notice a lot of these are food. And carbohydrates are my favorite food because I like pasta and pizza. So this is where I'm at. All right, for each of these, I've listed the number of functions you have, so make sure you're kind of paying attention to that. The elements, the monomers, and they should kind of go in order, and then the other important information here. And I know some of it will be kind of hidden, but I'll try to explain it all. So carbohydrates are essentially starches, and these are our sugars, and these are mainly our instant energy source. I'll be able to recognize carbohydrates because they tend to end in the suffix os, O-S-E. So you see one of the second functions of a carbohydrate is that it builds parts of cell walls. So it's the structure in plant cells. And that specific sugar is called cellulose. Another sugar that you probably have heard about is lactose. That's a sugar found in milk products. And sometimes you might be lactose intolerant, which means you can't break down that sugar correctly. The elements that make up carbohydrates, and it kind of says it in the name, carbohydrates, is carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Now notice here I give you a specific ratio of 1 to 2 to 1. So for every 1 carbon, I'll have 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen. So probably the most important carbohydrate that we'll talk about in this class, because we'll have basically an entire unit on it, where we talk about our cellular energy and photosynthesis and respiration, is glucose. Glucose is C6H12O6. And so again, if you break that down and reduce it down, it would become a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio of carbon to hydrogen to oxygen. The monomers for carbohydrates are monosaccharides, or really it's one sugar. And so if you look at the picture up in the top, there'd be one of those little hexagons, whereas a polysaccharide would be many of those hexagons put together. So there's different kinds of simple sugars. You could have a monosaccharide, again, one single monomer. You could have a disaccharide where you have just 2. And those tend to be like the sugars that we think about, like from the Snickers commercials, where if you're hungry, eat the Snickers. And then you immediately have a little bit of energy back because we can break those down quickly, fast, and easily. Whereas the more complex carbohydrates, things that we get in our pastas, in our breads and other starches, are more long chains or polysaccharides. And so that takes us through carbohydrates. Again, if I go too fast, which I know I'm talking fast, pause it, write everything down, and then we can move on. All right. Macromolecule number 2 are the lipids. These are fats and oils. These tend to be a lot of things that we would get in our desserts, things that not always the best for us. They have 3 main functions that you need to know about. Number 1, they are your long-term energy storage. So both of these first 2 molecules deal with energy. Carbohydrates are your quick energy. I can easily convert those into a usable source called ATP, which we'll talk about in our respiration unit. Whereas lipids are energy stored for a long term. I mean, think about the fats. It's hard to get rid of fat for a reason, because it's hard to break those down and convert them into usable energy. Secondly, and we'll talk about this quite a bit, is make up biological membranes and waterproof coverings, because that kind of goes together. So one of the main biological membranes that we'll talk about is the cell membrane. And so every cell has a cell membrane on the outside that is made up of a specific kind of lipids called phospholipids. And those are essentially waterproof because of the way they come together with the 2 layers of phospholipids, with the hydrophobic tails on the inside, hydrophilic heads on the outside. But again, we'll talk more about that in our cell unit. Again, lipids are made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. However, this does not have that 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. If you look in the picture up here, and that's an example of a triglyceride, tri meaning 3, so notice the 3 tails on there. It's made of long chains of hydrocarbons, so hydrogens and carbons in long, long chains. And so there's a lot more hydrogen and carbon in these than there is of oxygen. Lipids are not a true polymer, but we do kind of classify them in the same way. So we give them monomers, which typically are glycerol, which is the head. So it's that blue part on the far left in the picture, and then the fatty acid chains. So again, triglycerides, like this example of this fat, it has 3 chains. Phospholipids that I talked about earlier have just 2 chains. Other important information is that lipids are not soluble in water, and that there's 2 kinds, saturated and unsaturated. And we'll get more into that when we get into our big macromolecule lab that we do next time in class. All right, next we have our nucleic acids, and so these are DNA and RNA. So they have one main function, and that it's your genetic material. Now what that means is, and this is important to write down also, is that it's the instructions to build proteins. It's the instructions to put together my order of amino acids to build the proteins that do all the work for the cell. We have a longer list of elements now. We have carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus. And they are made up of 4 different kinds of monomers for DNA and 4 different kinds of monomers for RNA. So altogether, it's 5 total monomers. They are adenine, thymine, cytosine, guanine, and uracil. Uracil is only found in RNA. Thymine is only found in DNA. The examples, obviously, again, are DNA and RNA. If you break down or spell out those entire names, DNA is deoxyribonucleic acid, or RNA is ribonucleic acid. I also expect you guys to know the 3 parts of each nucleotide. And so you see letter A there. The little circle is the phosphate group. Letter B is my 5-carbon sugar. And I can always identify the 5-carbon sugar because it's a pentagon. It has 5 sides. And then C is the base. And so those bases are the adenine, the thymine, the guanine, or the cytosine. Now, in a DNA, where it's double-stranded, on the opposite side, I would have an upside-down nucleotide with a base also in the middle, and then the phosphate and the sugar on the outside on each side. And then the last ones that we have are the proteins. And you'll notice that the list of things that they do is much longer here. And so I'm going to give you an acronym to kind of help you remember this towards the end. So first off, the functions. They form bones and muscles. They control the rate of reactions. And we'll have a whole extra section just on that, which is specifically those are enzymes. They form structural purposes like your hair and nails and parts of the cell membrane and other parts of your cells. They transport substances, and they help fight disease. They're made of 4 main elements: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. Their monomers are amino acids, and there are 20 of these different amino acids. Most of these that we can make ourselves, some that we have to get by eating other things. So I told you guys I'll give you an acronym, and I don't want you to laugh at this. It's just an easy way to remember it. The 5 functions of proteins, Mr. STD. Muscles, reactions, structure, transport, disease. Mr. STD. All right. So again, one specific type of protein is an enzyme. Enzymes end in the suffix ase. So lactase is an example of an enzyme that breaks down lactose. And so we have lots of examples, and we'll do a lab on this where we'll be manipulating catalase inside of a potato by breaking it down with hydrogen peroxide. One of the most important things with proteins is that they have very complex three-dimensional shapes. And if anything happens to that shape, if that protein gets denatured in any way by a change in pH or a change in temperature, then those proteins change their shape. And that if they change their shape, they can't work and do the function that they need to do. We'll talk about a lot about this in our enzyme unit. And so here's my list of the 20 different amino acids. Some of these are some of my favorite words to say, like phenylalanine or isoleucine. They're just fun words to say. And like I said, I have a whole unit on putting amino acids together into proteins when we do our DNA and protein synthesis unit. You may have seen this chart before in middle school, and this is our amino acid chart, and this is how we convert our RNA sequences from our mRNA into our amino acids that will eventually become our proteins. So that takes us through the entire chart. Again, I know I went through it fast, so go back through anything that you need to. We'll talk a lot about this in class the next couple times that we see you guys in person. Don't forget to do the backside of this. I will be checking this next time that you are in person. Again, if you have any questions, let me know through email. Have a great day.